Coming up on Global Business, African companies expect Boao Forum 2023 to provide more opportunities for shared development in cooperation with Chinese companies. Chinese market is not an option but a must-have for multinational companies, says an Australian expert on supply chain planning. And confidence among German consumers strengthened for the sixth consecutive month heading into April, but concerns still remain on the inflation front. Hello and welcome to Global Business on CGTN. I'm Guan Xing in Beijing. We'll begin by looking at China's latest efforts to bolster consumption and investment. Chinese Premier Li Qiang said China will strengthen macro policy adjustments to further unlock the country's consumption and investment potential. Li held talks with International Monetary Fund Managing Director Kristalina Georgieva and said China's economy was on track to achieve its full-year economic goals. Premier Li will also deliver the keynote address at the opening ceremony of the Boao Forum for Asia on Thursday. Today marks the second day of the annual forum. Some 2,000 delegates from around the world have already arrived in Boao to share their insights. Meanwhile, Global Free Trade Ports Forum, a sidebar conference of Boao Forum for Asia, commenced on Wednesday. The conference aims to boost the institutional opening up in free trade. Reporter Shi Shaopeng has the story.
Guests from South Korea, Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, Cambodia, Mongolia, and China's Hong Kong SAR took part in the forum. They joined more than 150 representatives from 14 domestic free trade pilot zones, such as Shanghai, Hainan, and Liaoning. Participants discussed the role and functions of free trade zones or ports, international economic and trade rules, and promotion of regional economic integration. They also studied what efforts should be made to comprehensively deepen practical cooperation between Hainan and members of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCEP.
Yeah, I think this is a good idea of the forum because we have RCEP, we have a free trade forum, we have ASEAN-China free trade area. If those elements, similarity of the elements of those big agreement can be synergized, I think it will benefit Indonesia, China, ASEAN, China trade and investment relations in the very near future.
So this is the incentive for the people to come to invest because they, like I said, they feel that we have the common regulation law, we have the RCEP agreement, we have the bilateral agreement, we have the China-ASEAN agreement, and so on and so forth. So we have the common framework.
As well as building a free trade port, Hainan is aiming for round-island independent customs operation by the end of 2025. During the forum, participants also discussed the effective path for Hainan to build a high-level highland of opening up and studied how to integrate Hainan into the coordinated development of the Guangdong, Hong Kong, Macau Greater Bay Area.
Hong Kong has a very close relationship with ASEAN. Hainan Island is also close to ASEAN. I think these three areas can join hands, namely the Hainan Free Trade Port, Guangdong, Hong Kong, Macau, and the Greater Bay Area and the ASEAN region. We will strive to bridge cooperation, especially in the modern service industry.
Before the independent customs operation, the Hainan Free Trade Port must have a clear and more specific course of action, such as the policy system of our headquarters space, and our cooperation with Hong Kong, Guangdong, and the entire Greater Bay Area. These important issues need to be studied by 2025, so as to make the Free Trade Port a reality before 2035.
As a gateway, Hainan connects the Chinese mainland with Southeast Asia, two of the most active markets in the world. With status as a free trade port, combined with its offset policies, the region is looking forward to more regional development and international cooperation. Shao Peng, Sansha Satellite TV in Boao, Hainan Province, for CGTN.
During the forum, my colleague Lily Li spoke to Zhou He, Managing Director and China CEO of Australian Capital Equity, to get his suggestions for multinational firms on supply chain planning amid a complex global environment.
Mr. He, you attended the CEO Roundtable at the Boao Forum for Asia this year, and you spoke about global supply chain amid a complex environment. What is your suggestion for multinational companies in planning out their supply chain?
Under today's complex environment, we have witnessed that some administrative interference disrupted global supply chain. These have escalated the risks of supply chain disorder and global inflation. So as a consequence, multinational companies have to refocus on the issue of their supply chain security and take measures such as supplier diversification and inventory buildup in order to ensure supply chain stability. So in light of this, my suggestion is that multinational companies take a staged approach in their supply chain planning. In the short term, consider adding more suppliers to their chains and try to diversify away from the risks. But over the mid to long term, we should push all parties back to multilateral cooperative norms and work together to restore an integral, efficient, and stable global supply chain.
As China's economy is off to a rebound, what would be your suggestions for multinational companies, and how do you think they're positioning the China market now?
China has the world's most complete industrial chain and the largest domestic consumption market. And its economy rebound contributes a major engine to the growth of world economy. Multinational companies can seek further cooperation and direct investment opportunities in China. To multinational companies, Chinese market is not an option, but a must-have. With the help of a series of high-standard free trade agreements, such as RCEP and CPTPP, multinational companies will continue to root in China and contribute to regional integration and build an Asian-Pacific community with shared future for mankind.
Now let's touch upon the issue of the Hainan Free Trade Port. I know you've done some research in this topic. What would be your piece of advice for the Hainan Free Trade Port on how to attract more multinational companies?
It has been 5 years since President Xi Jinping announced to establish the Hainan Free Trade Port. The accomplishments during the 5 years of Hainan have proven that the policies and the design innovations will attract talents and capital to swarm into Hainan. Such efficient flow of key production factors will help Hainan FTP form its own industries, which in turn will attract more multinational companies along the industrial chains to join and form a large headquarters economy.
As a major engine of the world economy, the Asian economy is accelerating the pace of overall economic recovery this year. To understand more about African countries' view on this year's Boao Forum, let's cross to Robert Najila in Nairobi, Kenya. Hi there, Robert. Thank you for joining us. So what are Africa's expectations for this year's Boao Forum for Asia, and how has the Chinese path to modernization inspired policymakers in Africa?
Well, first of all, you've got to take into consideration the fact that in the past, this forum has been more focused about the development of Asia itself and member states of this that are part of this particular forum. So for Africa, it's not so much about expectations, but what will come out of this particular forum and how that will affect them, or what sort of impact that will have on them. If you look at part of the theme for this year's forum, they talk about an uncertain world. So Africa will be watching very closely what comes out of it in terms of climate change, for example, development grants, for example. So that will be their main focus, to see what comes out of it and how that impacts Africa and what sort of engagement Africa can then have with member states of this particular forum. In terms of modernization and how African policy makers are looking at this, it's still relatively new. So many policymakers will be looking at China to see what sort of shape, form and size this is going to develop into, how this will encompass, how this is going to be then implemented across China, before they can then start to see how this will resonate with particular or various countries back here in Africa. I think for Africa, what is important for them is the fact that it is people-centered and they'll be looking to see how this is going to affect the population back in China in terms of development, and how they can then replicate that back here looking at their own circumstance. So in both sides, I think it's more of let's see how this develops and what we can pick from there to implement back here at home.
Well, thank you very much for sharing with us. That was our reporter Robert Najila in Nairobi, Kenya for us. And now we're heading for a short break. Still to come on Global Business. Confidence among German consumers strengthened for the 6th consecutive month heading into April, but concerns still remain on the inflation front.
In 2023, the Boao Forum for Asia returns with full vigor.
As we move out of the shadow of the pandemic, how do we forge solidarity?
How do we build on RCEP and strengthen coordination in Asia and for Asia?
Where do we find new growth points as the world eyes economic recovery?
How do we contribute to a community of a shared future and navigate through the uncertainties?
Join us in our special coverage of the Boao Forum for Asia Annual Conference 2023 as we strive to answer these questions and more, only on CGTN.
Moving on to Europe, confidence among German consumers strengthened for 6 consecutive months heading into April. A survey by pollster GfK said consumer sentiment index is set to touch minus 29.5 in April from a revised reading of minus 30.6 in March, thanks to lower energy prices. It warned the overall consumer sentiment remained very low, as inflation is expected to remain high this year. The survey said German consumers are more pessimistic about the broad economic prospects. Recently, the country saw waves of strikes by workers seeking pay increases to cope with surging inflation. Major public transportation across Germany were at a standstill on Monday, causing disruption for millions during one of the largest walkouts over pay in decades. Despite that, data released today shows that German consumer confidence has been improving for 6 months. For more, let's cross to reporter Trent Murray in Berlin. Hi there, Trent. So the German consumer confidence data was released today. What are the main takeaways from the latest data? Has the data been affected by Monday's strike?
Guanjin, I think the real message from GfK's latest data is that the country is heading in the right direction, but there is more room to go. It is the 6th month in a row in which we have seen the overall sentiment improve, but it is a very small improvement given those numbers that you just shared. And for that reason, GfK is saying that the recovery is happening slower than they would like. April's reading shows that sentiment is on its way towards recovery according to GfK, but the pace of growth has slowed noticeably compared to previous months. Now, there is a couple of things happening here. Energy prices are starting to become, I think, less pronounced and less dramatic for a lot of households and businesses. We know natural gas prices are falling, but also some of those government relief measures are starting to help mitigate some of those rising costs. But the bigger problem still remains that record inflation, which is walloping not just Germany, but much of the Eurozone. We know grocery prices are up, as are electricity prices and just the general cost of living. And that really is hampering that effect on households when it comes to spending. You know, that spending and questions around what's known as the willingness to buy indicator, effectively when a consumer says, is now the right time to make a major purchase? And what the data shows is that there is still hesitation. But I should point you as well to some other data, if I could, and that is from the IFO. It is another influential think tank which has released data today. That is on the employment front. We've seen the employment barometer there rise just slightly again. IFO says that they think the labour market is proving very robust, particularly in manufacturing and the building sector, two really important sectors for the German economy. But as you mentioned, the big unknown right now moving forward is that rolling industrial action. We had that warning strike on Monday from unions that pretty well brought the country to a standstill. No airports, trains, metro services in many cities not operating. If that continues, that inevitably will have a major impact. So I think the country is not out of the woods yet, so to speak, when it comes to the economic situation, but the signs are things are improving. We will have to see whether that pattern remains going into the spring and the summer.
I hope the event will not derail the nascent recovery. And that was Tran Murray for us in Berlin. Thank you very much for your report. And now for more insights on the transport strike in Germany, we're joined by Cecilia Emma Sottilota, Assistant Professor of Political Science at the University for Foreigners of Perugia in Italy. Thank you for joining us, Professor. So help us understand the mega strike, which is reported to be the most severe in 31 years. According to media reports, it was very rare for dispute over pay to escalate so much. Tell us why.
It is true. This was presented, and it is in fact unprecedented in German recent history. But we must also consider that the current circumstances in which Germany and Europe as a whole find themselves are also extraordinary. So we are coming out of a couple of years that have been bumpy, to say the least, between the pandemic and the war in Ukraine, which generated a number of issues also connected to raising costs of living. So Germany has always been particularly wary of inflation. You know, there's a past in that sense. There's a history in that sense that suggests that raising costs of living the population in general and also the political class are particularly sensitive to raising costs of living, again, inflation going up. So this is basically what is motivating the current situation, and the requests that trade unions are making will need to be met to some extent if these strikes, if the authorities want these strikes to end soon.
So what is the root cause of the discontent, and to what extent is the overall economy responsible for it?
I think that the problem here is that we are seeing a situation of, problems, I would say, in the redistribution of wealth in general. I think that the reason why people are especially worried is that we are seeing increasing inequality. We are seeing an increasing number of people, but this is, again, not limited to Germany, of working poor, meaning that people work. And this is like, if you listen to the interviews of German people in the streets, what they say is like, I could cope pretty well up until a couple of years ago. Now I work all the time, and there's no way I can make ends meet at the end of the month. So there's this very strong motivation. Now, naturally, the fact that these strikes have been so, at least right now, until now, successful in bringing the country to a standstill is due to the fact that Germany's trade unions are strong and organized, stronger than trade unions in other countries, for instance, in Italy.
Well, it is reported that the strike is paralyzing the country. What's the impact on the country's economy already grappling with high inflation?
I think that the immediate impact is not that remarkable because we are talking about the short term, and companies, for instance, had been informed. This strike have been announced, so it didn't come as a surprise, so companies could prepare. The big question, though, is whether and to what extent these strikes will drag on. These were really, I think they were just, trade unions were just flexing their muscles, so to speak. So unless an agreement is found in the next few days, the situation could get worse.
Well, thank you very much for your analysis. There was Cecilia Emma Sottilota, Assistant Professor of Political Science at the University for Foreigners of Perugia in Italy for us. Anger continues to simmer in France as the government doubles down on its controversial pension reform plan that raises the working person's retirement age. On Tuesday, French unions signed a joint letter to President Emmanuel Macron calling for mediation to end the strikes and junk the proposed reform. And Ross Cullen reports from Paris.
2 months of demonstrations and the flames of protests still alight. Tuesday marked the 10th day of mass mobilisation in France. The unions determined to continue to take steps to keep up the pressure on the government to scrap its controversial pension reforms.
In reality, this has to end with the government giving in. There are demonstrations everywhere. There are strikes. There are refineries that are closed. There are social movements in every city, and there are many, many protesters.
80% of the French are against this. We're in a democracy, and the French people don't want this.
As trash continues to pile up in Paris, protesters denouncing the president's policy as rubbish. The number of students attending the demonstrations has been growing in recent weeks, but overall Tuesday's protests weren't as busy as last week's marches, and there are signs of possible progress on dialogue.
After more than 2 months of demonstrations, there could be some movement from the opposing sides. The unions have written a joint letter to the president calling for mediation, and the Prime Minister has said she's ready for opposition talks next week.
There are still tensions on the streets though. In Paris and other cities in France, tear gas and smoke mixing as some protests turned violent. Demonstrators say the reform is unjust and unfairly impacts women and lower paid workers, and the economic costs are starting to add up. Marchers lose a day's pay by going on strike. France's tourism minister said on Monday that she's worried about the impact to the country's hotels and restaurants ahead of the upcoming spring holidays. Ross Cullen, CGTN, Paris.
Moving on to some other business headlines, and we're tracking at this hour. Consumer confidence fell slightly in France to 81 in March from 82 in February, in line with market expectations. It was the lowest reading since September 2022. South Korea's inflation expectations showed the first fall in 3 months in March due to higher interest rates. Its consumer sentiment index reported the highest increase in 9 months since last June, and it was attributed to the slower rise in consumer prices and the lifting of COVID-19 control measures. And UK's shop price inflation accelerated to a record 8.9% in March. The cost of living crisis has seen shoppers visit more but buy less, and they manage their weekly food bills and always seek out the lowest prices. The annual China-Europe Cross-Border E-Commerce Forum is taking place this week in Britain. Retailers and logistics companies are looking to expand their business through booming cross-border e-commerce. Our reporter Michael Voss brings us more.
Most major Western luxury brands now have a physical presence in China and also sell their products there online. Supply chain issues made international sales more difficult during COVID, but now that global trade is picking up, e-commerce companies are trying to expand into new markets.
There's a growing interest in China, particularly amongst the younger generation, to be able to buy the smaller boutique European brands directly online. Now China's e-commerce industry is looking for ways to make this happen.
The annual China-Europe Cross-Border E-Commerce Forum is taking place this week in Britain's second city, Manchester. Among the participants is Miles Barclay, whose startup will provide a range of smaller prestige retailers, including several of the famous men's outfitters in London's Savile Row, with an online presence in China.
What you're seeing with Gen Z is a massive interest to connect with new brands, more experimental, and I think in that case luxury is more personal to them. They're looking to connect with brands who have values that really speak to them personally, rather than the traditional status symbols that maybe their parents' generation were. And this change in consumer behavior and demographic is really what we're trying to tap into.
Barclay has signed a contract with China's giant logistics and online shopping portal JD, a one-stop shop providing everything from the online marketplace to getting the goods from the UK to China.
They opened a shop in JD. We call it JD Global Purchase. It's a platform especially for import products from outside of China. So they open a shop there, and then what we are doing is we help them to consolidate all the products here in UK, and by air freight we transport them back to China.
Chinese manufacturers are also looking to sell directly to online customers in Europe. Yodel is a UK parcel delivery company with about 15% of its business coming from imports from China.
It's an important challenge with our Chinese importers to try and get deliveries into out-of-home locations, not just to consumers' home. And by out-of-home, I'm talking about pick-up and drop-off locations or lockers. So we need to work now with the Chinese retailers to be able to have that as an option.
The main theme of this week's Europe-China e-commerce forum is on improving logistics post-pandemic, with major players from both Europe and China working together to explore industry developments and innovation. Michael Voss, CGTN, Manchester.
Italy is expecting 3 million visitors from China this year after the easing of COVID-19 controls. The country is seen as one of top destinations in Europe for Chinese tourists who make a significant contribution to the local economy. Hermina Kitson reports.
Spring signals the start of Italy's peak tourist season, which this year welcomes the return of travellers from China.
I really like Italy, especially Rome. It's amazing.
It's very famous, Italy, and it has very old buildings in here. So I think this is a big attractive point for me.
Yeah, it's really special.
There's been a steady rise in bookings from China after COVID-19 restrictions were eased. Cristiano Vorotti is the China manager at the Italian National Tourist Board and says this is the moment the industry has been waiting for.
I've been spending the whole pandemic period in China, and it's been pretty tough, not having the opportunity to travel out of the country. So I'm pretty sure that now that the Chinese borders are finally open, everyone is really happy to go back traveling abroad.
Paolo Bellet manages 3 hotels in the capital and says that post-pandemic, Chinese travellers are willing to pay more for a different approach.
Normally in the past, they were only traveling by groups. Now we can see the Chinese are booking individuals, and this is very important, very interesting.
In addition to the Eternal City, high on the agenda for Chinese tourists is the commercial hub of Milan and cities of art such as Venice and Florence. Experts say they're high spenders who make a significant contribution to key industries.
And especially they are concentrated in those areas that are really important for Made in Italy. Fashion, food, design, and that's very important for us.
According to the Italian National Institute of Statistics, in 2019, 5.3 million Chinese tourists travelled to Italy. And while it remains the #1 destination in Europe, a return to pre-pandemic levels isn't expected until 2024. But even a predicted 60 to 70% recovery of Chinese tourism this year will provide a boost to Italy's economy.
The connection between Italy and China is historical. So we had always an exchange of business, and therefore the Chinese are always more than welcome.
A partnership set to restart and revive business and cultural ties between the two countries. Hermione Kitson, CGTN, Rome.
And that would do it for this edition of Global Business here on CGTN. Thank you for being with us. The Point with Liu Xing is coming up next. Stay tuned.